Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just allow another couple of seconds for the full audience to join that we're anticipating this afternoon for our webinar. So just bear with me for a minute. Good afternoon again. We're delighted to see you present virtually for our October webinar, and we're delighted in this instance to welcome along Dr. Patrick McKeon, founding member of AWARE and a consultant psychiatrist, who will be able to give us his huge amount of wisdom and knowledge in relation to bipolar disorder and depression, with the idea being that we can speak to these conditions regarding as managing as well or as best as we can. The October webinar is in conjunction or around the same time as World Mental Health Day, which took place on Monday. So we're really looking forward to this discussion and conversation between myself, the Director of Services at AWARE, and Dr. Patrick McKeon. We'll also be able to field some questions that you may have to Dr. Patrick McKeon a bit later on, and also see how we get on with that discussion. So there's a few questions and ideas that we'll have together to go through in the coming time, and we'll see how we get on in the next hour. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce you, Pat, now, and to generate the discussion together. If you have a few opening remarks in relation to bipolar disorder and depression and how it can be managed well.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to do this webinar. Something I appreciate very much.
Welcome.
I think the thing about bipolar disorder and depression is that they're conditions that are very common, but it's very important right at the outset to say they're treatable. Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of many of the people coming to the webinar for the first time. Some knowledgeable about these topics, others it's their first outing. So it's important that we keep sight of the needs of both groups. Mm. Bipolar disorder, as most people will know, bi as it means, has two poles, depression and elation. As such, these sort of conditions, they're very obvious at one level, but one of the biggest problems in dealing with bipolar in particular is that it takes quite a long time for it to be recognized, simply because people or their families indeed at times do not recognize when the person is mildly elated, and as such it can be quite a problem. So much so that almost 40% of people who have recurring depression, in fact, it's not recurring depression they have, it's actually bipolar. Mm. And for that reason, the condition gets overlooked. Depression, on the other hand, is an experience people very often recognize right from the start, because it's an upsetting condition. It's causing them distress, pain, sleep disturbance, fatigue, inability to concentrate, and so forth. But on the other hand, many people who get depressed, it will first present with, they will come along with anxiety, and not actually that behind that anxiety is depression. So people often focus when they have depression or bipolar disorder, what's the best treatment? What can I do? Often the key thing is getting the diagnosis right. Because if you don't have the diagnosis right, it's very difficult then to get the treatment that will work best for that person.
Yeah, that's very helpful to hear, and I suppose in that, and we'll come to that towards the tail end of the discussion around how to access support and how to generate information for yourself around that, and where the best avenues of that might come from, and for a lot of people, the first port of call is their general practitioner, their GP, to engage in a conversation with that person. And also, obviously, at AWARE, we have our own suite of support services, support groups, and the support line, which we'll speak to a little bit later. But the accuracy of diagnosis allows a person to manage the condition because it gives that idea of information, and that a person then has the knowledge with the view then to being able to take some action, and affirmative action in that way, in consultation with their mental health professional of whatever discipline it is. And how would you kind of see that playing out, Pat? What would you see as being helpful, in those conversations between people who have depression and or bipolar disorder with their treating mental health professionals?
I suppose really the main thing with depression is people's reluctance to come forward with the problem.
Mm.
If I'd say that the biggest barrier to treatment, management of these problems, is actually the fear of what people will think about the person.
Mm. Mm.
And right from the outset, if a person can address they really are 50% of the way. So simply write down how they're feeling, even keeping a diary for themselves, a journal, and adding to that each day, because when you do that, you're letting your mind see, your whole brain see.
Very good.
What's actually there.
Mm.
That really cracks the problem open, because then once you've said it to yourself and you begin to accept what it is you're experiencing within yourself, then you're ready more often than not to speak to a family member or a friend, or to seek professional help for the problem. But time and time again, that is the biggest issue, is people concealing the problem. People will think, stupid, I'm a bad person, I'm not able, I'm not capable. There's plenty of help there for people with depression. It's to reach out, to avail of the services that Aware provide, GPs provide, psychiatrists, psychologists provide. It's all there. Trouble is with particularly the depressed brain, is that it is a great sense of shame or guilt.
Yes.
Constantly ridiculing itself, and if only the person can step outside that. But I often think that the key issue right at the start is writing down those thoughts that are going to mind, because once you write them down, you're objectifying them. In other words, they're not locked in your head. You're actually shrinking the power that they have over you once you actually write them down. Because you write them down, you say, well, is that true? Am I really that stupid? Do I feel guilty? Have I a reason to feel guilty? Did I actually do those things that I thought I did? And the immediate answer is no, I didn't.
Yeah, that's very helpful and a very tangible takeaway for people who are taking part in this webinar and who are in the audience, as you say, and very helpfully say, people maybe reaching out for support for the first time, or making contact with Aware for the first time, and also people who are regular users or ongoing users of Aware services or the mental health services in general. I suppose just to speak to that, as I was listening to you, just to speak to that point in specific reference to depression and the idea of self-recrimination, or the idea of engaging in the internal self-talk that can be very self-critical. One of the ways out of that, as you said, perhaps is to write, that kind of takes some of the power away, and to examine some of the evidence. How common is that kind of thinking, do you think, in relation to a person who is diagnosed with depression or is experiencing depression?
It's extremely common.
And
it's so much part of the person that they actually don't recognize it. It's often people can have feelings of depression, anxiety, panic, and so forth, but often unaware of the thoughts that are circulating around in their head. And thus they can't turn off that tap until they actually there is a tap there. Now let me reach out and turn it off. Reaching out means just simply writing the stuff down, communicating it to others, because each time you do that, you're taking control over the situation.
Yes.
This tap continue. Now, there are a lot of other techniques and so on that follow on from this, but that very simple step. Now, sometimes if a person cannot write down that stuff, and the thoughts are impeding them in their day-to-day life, the best thing to do is to take small steps in terms of what is the next right thing I can do. Now, the next right thing might be, well, actually, will you tie your shoelaces, or will you pick that cloth up off the ground? Because to do that, you have to focus on doing it. And as you're focusing on doing it, you're putting those torrential thoughts of self-recrimination to one side. So sometimes the way to deal with thoughts is actually to take the next right small step. And I do mean small. It can be a very trivial thing. You say, what's the point in that? The point in that is that you actually create momentum in your body, which gives you momentum in your brain and stops you going round and round in the circle of thinking in this negative way. So if a person, we say, has difficulty getting out of bed in the morning and they're waking up and their mind is full of negative thoughts, I often say to people, the first thing to do is put your foot on the floor and move. Don't think. Don't think. Because once you've gone even a few steps, you're focusing on, I need to open the bathroom door, I'm going to turn on the tap, etc. And in that way, you escape your thoughts. And that momentum is, again, the power that you can have almost in an instant over what's going on within you. So our behavior frequently has to precede dealing with the thoughts because the thoughts are so strong. But then the thoughts settle in that way, and then you can maybe get to the point of being able to write them down and to talk them through and think about the relevance of those thoughts. Now, as I said, there are through CBT and other psychotherapeutic techniques, there are many ways you can address those. But sometimes I think as clinicians, we can overlook the importance of a behavioral approach right from to tone down the distress a person is feeling in their mind.
Very helpful, Pat. And just to go back a little bit to what you were saying, I think there's importance that in what you said was as intervening as early as possible. So what I linked in that in my mind, listening to you, was the idea that if you intervene, in other words, not pretending that something isn't happening, if you're experiencing persistent low mood, as we often say here at Aware, that depression is very much different, and it's not just about having a bad day or a bad week. Depression is a very debilitating experience and condition to have. And it's really to intervene as early as possible, I think, is what you're advocating. And doing that individually by trying to change your behavior and reaching out to support. What's the benefit of that early intervention, do you think, more broadly, for a person?
Well, I suppose what I'd say is that it's useful for people to realize that everyone gets depressed. For most people, thankfully, it's not disabling. So in a sense, depression is a normal phenomenon. If I'm expecting something good to happen today and it doesn't turn out, I'm going to feel something about that. That's nature's way of teaching us to be careful how we invest our emotions, our expectations in the future, relationships we have. In other words, be realistic about what's going to be happening in your life. Once a person becomes aware that they are clinically depressed or it's getting a hold on them, and that becomes evident when there are several symptoms or feelings of depression, fatigue, poor concentration, and so forth, and that's not just for a minute or an hour or 2 hours or a few days, but when it's getting to 10, 14 days, that person then needs to realize, this is significant. I need to do something about this.
And that's the time not to pretend. And there's where some of the maybe perhaps some of the difficulty might lie at a time where your thinking maybe is slowing down and your concentration isn't as it was, and that your thinking might be more unhealthy, if I put it that way, is the very time to say, I need to reach out for support now. So that there's something in that to try and grapple with that's not easily answerable, I suppose.
It's not easily answerable, but I think things have improved a lot in that sense.
Yes.
In days gone by, you would never see any, we say, coach coming on radio or TV and talking about how awful they feel about the way the team is doing. For the past 10, 15 years, you'd hear that quite readily. You know, I was gutted, I didn't know what to do, etc.
Yes.
So it's the change in the dialogue that's happened around emotional health has improved significantly over the past 20 years. And what that means is that if people are talking about it way before they get to the point of being clinically depressed, that's right. Because to change behaviors in any area of mental health, it's when you get to the point where it's picked up at a very, very early stage. And where people can speak openly about feelings of depression or bipolar disorder at an earlier stage, it means that their whole trajectory of progress and to recovery is much more smooth and shorter.
Yes.
See, depressions and bipolars illnesses are treatable. But the problem is that if they're not treated early, they have they shape the person's personality. It determines whether the person up with an alcohol problem or a drug problem. It determines maybe whether their marriage is going to last, whether the employment they're in is going to last. So even though these things are treatable, the conditions themselves, the complications that they cause in the person's life, often are the thing that really cause them the real problem. Even though they've recovered from the mood problem, may end up with very few relationships in life, maybe be out of work, be in financial trouble, maybe have an alcohol problem. So that's why early treatment is important.
Yeah, and that idea, it's such a positive message and one of hope, that, and one that we espouse at Aware, of course, in relation to recovery being possible and that the conditions are treatable. And it's great to promote that message and to say it as loudly as possible. If I was to kind of hang around or stick around the condition of depression just for a couple of more minutes, Pat, I suppose another question I have is, the importance or the significance of, exercise, sleep and diet. And how central do you think, those factors are in managing the condition of depression?
I'm a great believer in the need for momentum. Because I think that even the smallest degree of movement is mood elevating. And they say one way of working out how effective any type of treatment is, the question is often asked, how many people with, we say, depression have you got to treat with this intervention to see somebody improve? So if you take 10 people with depression and you get them to exercise regularly, what you will find is that 80% of those will improve in mood. Now that's more effective than most antidepressants, most psychotherapies. And you underestimate the power of exercise in that way. But we've also got to be careful. Exercise does elevate a person's mood. It gets the brain active, but it also can make the person too active. So for example, if somebody is slightly high and they're exercising excessively through the day and late into the evening, they then won't sleep at night, which in turn will trigger a high. So it is a powerful tool, and even small amounts of exercise is beneficial. The second most important thing I think that people can do in terms of helping their mood is to be very watchful of the amount of alcohol they're taking.
Yeah.
I go so far as the first time I see somebody with depression, I would ask them to stop drinking for a month. Not asking whether they have an alcohol, irrespective of whether they have an alcohol problem or not, because it is quite remarkable how frequently people will come back even after a fortnight and say, just with that alone, that their mood improves significantly. So we are often very unaware of the impact of alcohol on mood.
Yeah, it's very helpful to hear. Very helpful indeed. Just to speak a little bit, I suppose, in relation to some of the, to stick around, we'll move on to bipolar disorder in a couple of minutes. But in relation to, I was reading a few bit of literature recently around the social aspect of depression and the experience of distress, and I suppose empathizing and understanding that there are social determinants that connect or link to depression. And just to gauge some of your thoughts on that, to expand it out from, what an individual can empower themselves and how they can work through and develop their own sense of self-esteem in working through their experience of depression and lifting their mood or elevating their mood. But coming back to the idea of some of the social aspects around it, if you could comment, or if you had any thoughts on that, that would be helpful.
Well, after exercise, I would put social interaction as the best present.
Yeah.
Frequently, people don't understand the power of having a void like that in their lives, of not having any contact with people, until we say maybe the person living with passes on or leaves. They find themselves home alone and maybe not having any work to go to. But many things like that are give social nurturance to people in their day-to-day lives. It's only when that's removed that people really understand the power of it. So when people get depressed, depression actually compounds the problem then, because it removes people from contact with others, because who'd want to be talking to me? I'm not a worthwhile person. And all these other rubbish thoughts go through the head. And that then compounds the problem.
Yes.
One of the things that I've always been struck about is when people with depression come along to an aware support group. And after 2 or 3 meetings, it's remarkable just that what being with others does for them, even if they're saying just by being there and listening to others and engaging and absorbing the information and the warmth of the group and the support of the group, it makes a big change in that person's life. Now, again, very often clinicians don't fully understand the power of that type of interaction. They would see it, obviously, and understand it in terms of a bereavement or something of a major nature. But replacing that void in a person's life through simple social contact is extremely powerful.
Yeah, I concur, on the idea of that, and going back to the idea of the warmth and support that is on offer, from a person who may very well be, on their own or have no one in their life who understands their experience, and meeting people in an aware support group provides that space to meet people, and that a person feels understood, I think, is the fundamental aspect of it, whether they say anything or not, as you say. But it allows and it provides a vehicle, I think, too, for someone to come out of their head, that it's not just me, or other people have had the same thoughts or think the same way as I do. So I suppose in one sense, we're advocating for people to engage in that social interaction. That there's a variety of support services there, and obviously speaking specifically to our own here at Aware and the support groups, and they're very generative, and the progress that can be made for someone, as you've spoken to, is very helpful, Pat. So thank you. If we were to move it a little bit from the condition of depression over to the condition of bipolar disorder, and one of the things I was struck by in a recent conversation with you was the idea that, and it's coming from the idea of, is it acceptance? I'll be interested to hear your thoughts, that it's a recurrent condition, and the importance of that vis-a-vis in respect of bipolar disorder. Could you say a little bit about that, if you could?
If depression or bipolar disorder were one-off occurrences, it'd be great, but they're not. And people wish it were otherwise, but those sort of facts have to be faced. Surveys show that if a person has a one-off episode of a high manic episode, the chances of that recurring at some stage or other in the person's life over 90%. But don't be frightened of that. The point is a condition that can be treated. The prevention of these things becomes the key issue, and having techniques to ensure that their mood is kept stable, that they've an appropriate lifestyle, that they get a certain amount of exercise, that they consume little or no alcohol or other substances are key. Even things like caffeine, the impact that can have on disrupting a person's mood is quite profound. It appears now that people with bipolar disorder are more susceptible to the effects of alcohol, more susceptible to the motivating effects of caffeine and so forth, which in turn then go on and disrupt the person's sleep, and which really expands the problem quite significantly. So in terms of accepting the recurring nature of the condition, it's a big ask. But again, like any problem we're faced with in life, if we don't look at it head on and address it, measure, wrap your arms around it, and don't walk away from it. You have to get into the cage with it and size it up and address it. But once you do that, you're actually becoming again the master of the situation that you find yourself in. It's very hard for people to accept the tendency for things to recur. But the fact that it does, once the person begins to accept that, then they're able to accept the need for maybe ongoing medication to keep their mood stable. But it can take time for a person to arrive at that point. If that person has the opportunity to meet other people who've gone through that journey, who sort of run away from the condition, the illness and the diagnosis in the beginning, and bit by bit they've come back to it, that person can be a great guide to somebody who's new to this situation, because very often people have great difficulty accepting their condition within bipolar. And this applies particularly to people who in the early stages of their bipolar illness only get episodes of elation. So we know that about 10% of people, 5 to 10% of people with bipolar disorder have what's called a unipolar type of mania. And don't get lows as such. Because you see, the thing about depression within bipolar disorder, because the depression is so awful for the person, it's the great teacher. Look, hey, you better do something about me.
Yeah.
Right. This is going to keep coming. Whereas with somebody who's constantly in and out of episodes of elation, they've almost no overt mood pain as such.
Yeah.
And thus find it hard to come to terms with the need for a preventative approach.
Yeah, because it's their loved ones, their friends and their relatives, and who would often notice the debilitating actions around that high prospectively or the elated phase. In its initial kind of recognition or trying to intervene. Yeah, sure. I suppose linked to, I'm going back a little bit now regarding, and without generalizing too much, I was thinking about shame and guilt and the idea of self-reproachment and that kind of excessive internal critical voice. And I wonder, is there a space for that we can manage and think about as an organization where depression and bipolar disorder are our area, of intervention and of focus, and that by speaking, that actually having conversations that are destigmatizing can afford a better management of the conditions. So it's about, at an individual level, trying to master the condition, but also more broadly, that ongoing conversations around depression and bipolar disorder can serve a very helpful purpose too.
Yes, the whole issue about stigma is that it's probably a manifestation of depression. It's always struck me how maybe when people are depressed within bipolar disorder, they feel guilt-ridden, shame, hide their. That same person a few weeks later, maybe in a mildly elated state, want to tell everybody about how they are and about their diagnosis. So, given that depression is so common in society, my belief is that it is probably the basis of much of the stigma associated with the condition. If you think of it like this, that often within Aware, we've done some surveys in the past looking at this, and what we found was that people who could at the outset be quite open about their condition, talk about it in a very matter-of-fact way with their families, friends, employers, and so forth, they made a much speedier recovery from their condition. People who hide it, won't go to the GP, won't talk to family, totally deny that there's any problem. They tend to have to live a life of solitude and guilt and depressive symptoms. And as such, it's very difficult for them to be otherwise. So what these surveys we conducted showed that it's often people, for example, in professions where the person is self-employed and they can get on with their lives, and they don't mind talking about their condition because they are their own employer, as it were. The other interesting things was that it's often people of a younger age group that are more positive and more able to be open about their condition, whereas people of an older age group find it much more difficult. So if a person can realize that stigma is probably a symptom of mental unwellness. In other words, we objectify it and say it's out there, but the reality of it is it's in everyone to a certain extent.
Sure.
Because we are the people that create the environment that we live in.
Yeah.
Helping people to be open about it is extremely important.
Yeah.
That's again one of the big advantages people tell us about when they go to support groups, because someone stepped over the line into a support group meeting. They find it easier to be open with their family, with their employers, and so on, in a judicious way, sharing what's appropriate, and making sure that the impact of depression and its consequences is limited in how much it can do in their lives.
Yeah, it's very helpful and encouraging the idea that a person experiencing depression or bipolar disorder would be encouraged to be as open as possible and to step into that space, recognizing that it's not always easy and it can take time, as we've said a little bit earlier in the conversation. Yeah, it's very helpful to hear that encouraging space for people to come out of themselves and to speak as openly as they can, and that's developmental as well, isn't it? And with the right supports, people become more open, as you say, appropriately. So yeah, I'm just going to move across maybe to some interaction we've had from the audience, Pat. And one of the points I suppose coming up is in relation to, interestingly, that at times, and maybe it's more seen, and in the manifestation of bipolar disorder, but also in depression, your sense of that by recognizing it, and I think by recognizing through self-awareness and hopefully people's awareness from attending this webinar, is that irritability, anger, and aggression can be in the mix of feelings or symptoms for both depression and bipolar disorder. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. I think one of the first points to make is that depression isn't a uniform condition.
Yes.
Many different subtypes of it.
Mm.
If somebody has a lot of irritability and anger as part of a depression, more often than not, it's related to something they've lost in their lives.
Mm.
A bereavement, a relationship that hasn't worked out, a career ambition that the person now realizes they're a person who regrets not having children and is having difficulties coming to terms with that.
Mm.
Because depression, by its very nature in itself, for most people, is actually the opposite to being irritable.
Mm.
They're on an opposite spectrum.
Mm.
But on the other hand, if you've somebody who's had a loss in their life, initially, they will have a lot of anger.
Mm. Sure.
And that is just, again, in keeping with what you'd see in a bereavement phenomenon.
Sure.
People who would have, we say, within the context of depression, have a lot of irritability, and it gets worse in the evening time, and they have trouble getting to sleep at night.
Yes.
They may indeed have what's called a mixed mood state, which is a mixture of depression and mania. And as such, the condition is more in keeping with bipolar disorder than with depression per se.
Mm.
You see, irritability, it's a sort of an agitation within the brain.
Yes.
And if there's a lot of that agitation and it's not real, there's no obvious great loss in the person's life, you've got to look at it, well, maybe this is part of the mixed mood state of bipolar disorder.
Mm. Yeah, that's very helpful. Very good. There was a point made from a member of the audience who's thinking about a person who doesn't realize, and it's back to the awareness idea, that they may have depressive symptoms, that they have come to see that the feelings that they have are normal, or are trying to acknowledge and validate them. Would this, how do you come to a place then, the person is wondering about, writing down the feelings or writing down the thoughts, you know. So what begets the other? What's the first step in it, I suppose?
Well, let me say from at the outset, there's no easy answer to all these.
Yeah.
This type of situation, because it's something we hear an awful lot on the support line and other things. I've listened to it for years from relatives and so on. I think the first thing is that just to re-emphasize just what you've said is that when a person has been depressed for a long period of time, it becomes normal in their lives. And that's often because, well, it's there a long time and they've had to adapt to it. The second point is that the person is cut off from or doesn't see the relevance of the negative thoughts that are there with them. They're disconnected from their mood. They've got their mood here and the thoughts are over here.
Yes.
And they don't see that there's a connection between them. So coming back to the main point of your question is, where do you start with this? I think the thing is often best to look at what else is on the person's mind who you think got symptoms of depression. Have they lost interest in their usual pursuit? Did they give up following their favorite football? Have they lost interest in their food in a sort of maybe a low way? Do they have difficulty concentrating? Do they have a sleep disturbance? Now, more often than not, you will find that this person that the relative is talking about has one symptom that's bugging them. If what you do then is forget about the word depression, don't use it. Just say, okay, do you not think you could go and talk to your doctor about your problem with your sleep? Don't stop. That's it. Now, frequently, you may not get anywhere with that. Another way around it is if within the family or in the extended circle of friends, if there is somebody who has gone through a depression, again, help getting them to share their experiences with the person. It can be helpful. Because again, it's helping that person who the family think is depressed, helping them by through dialogue with a family member or friend. It can often be the can opener, as it were, and along the right road. Ultimately, in some instances, you've got to step back and accept that this person just isn't ready, and you've got to look at how much it's bothering you that they're not addressing it. And you look after your own health, because sometimes there are situations beyond our control, and we really have to say to ourselves, look, I've got to take care of myself here.
Yeah, indeed.
I'm not able to help Tom at the moment. Maybe in time he'll come round. Because sometimes stepping back from a person rather than constantly knocking on the door of their mind is the best way.
Yeah, indeed, and to follow that on, that's instructive. You know, the idea that as a family member, there's a few family members here, you know, who are the main support of a person with depression. You know, the importance of them being included in the ongoing kind of, it's not just wellness plan, but kind of support plan or the support structure, and to speak to that, whether their person is receiving medical care or not, both, I suppose, both aspects of recovery and treatment.
Yeah, we're connected to people by our emotions. When our mood goes down, it affects everyone around us. So much so that I would have often witnessed myself being, as a junior doctor, being called down to the admissions office to interview somebody, and there might be two people sitting there in the waiting area, and you'd call in the wrong person. Simply that the more distressed person there was the relative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the counterpoint of that is that often the first manifestation that somebody with depression is beginning to recover from their condition is you can actually see the relative has improved. They look brighter. Yes. It's quite amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's seen it time and time again. So it's important to recognize that the intensity of the emotional link with family is one that gets very kicked about with the mood problem. Moods, emotions, relationships are emotions. So it gets. Yeah, very, very helpful. And there's something about that, and you've mentioned it, that sometimes standing back as opposed to knocking on the door of a person's mind can be helpful, because there's a few comments in relation to, and I'm conscious of we're not engaging in an individual kind of response, or this isn't about giving individuals advice. It's a broader based webinar and trying to keep it about the ideas that are coming in from the audience. But that if a person is not in the space to hear, maybe, or is not seeing necessarily what's going on for them, kind of the idea around that is it's vexatious, isn't it? It's hard to ascribe kind of definitively what to do if a relative or loved one, in the person's eyes, there's a few people saying it, that they're depressed or they're in an elated phase, and what to do. What thoughts do you have around how that relative or friend can manage as well as they can? Well, maybe just focusing specifically on the one regarding elation, because it's a more difficult issue. When somebody is elated, you're not going to get through to them. And what's necessary is to ensure that they're brought to the doctor and get some medical help, medication to address, because the more and more you try and get the message across to the person that they're unwell, they will say, "No, I feel perfectly well. What are you on about? Why are you getting so distressed? You're very bothered about the way I am. I'm fine. I don't know what's on. I've never had so much energy and enthusiasm for doing things, and you're just interfering in my life." So that would be the dialogue. But the point is that when it gets to the point where the person has lost insight into their condition,
yes,
that's another issue altogether, and the person really has to get appropriate treatment. Now, when a person gets treatment and the mood settles down, knowing that this can be a recurring condition, it's very important that the person who has been through the period of elation can choose somebody in their life, somebody whose judgment they trust, and ask them to be what people call a spotter in their life.
Yes.
Because a next of kin can spot a person's change in mood by a single word that the person uses, by the way they hold their head, by the volume of their voice on the phone, whatever. They can pick it up. So having somebody like that there in the person who has a tendency to highs and lows means that the high can be picked up at a very, very early stage. The appropriate maybe change in medication can be taken to settle the matter. If a person doesn't have that in their life, it is a real problem from the point of view of managing bipolar illness. The importance of that and how much they can contribute to the recovery of somebody with bipolar disorder is enormous. As a clinician, I would have always expected that a family member would accompany them to every outpatient consultation.
Very good.
It's not
Yes.
that one, you'd see maybe the person with the condition first, then the family member would join the meeting, and we'd have a three-way conversation. It wouldn't be dealing with necessarily any of the personal issues that are private to the patient in that instance.
Yes.
And it's no breach of confidentiality. It's a safeguard. As I often say to people who have bipolar, is that you need to pick somebody in your life who you trust.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't, you're going to end up having to trust the illness. Which is it? Are you going to trust?
Yeah, very good point.
Are you going to have somebody there? Now, that's people say, well, I'm not giving up my independence and so forth. But bit by bit, people realize it makes all the difference.
Yeah.
I've seen umpteen people over the years who've adopted that approach of having a spotter in their life. What it's meant is they've never had a serious relapse. They've never in 30 years needed to go into hospital. They've never had significant periods of time off work. So
yeah,
people would often say that, the treatments aren't great. Well, actually, that is not the key issue at the moment. The key issue about stigma and acceptance of the condition, being open and being able to talk about it, and coming to terms with the condition that the person has, are equally important.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
And this is why I was delighted when Aware recently set up the Living Well with Bipolar program. It's a fantastic program, and anyone that has a chance to do it really is strongly recommended.
Yeah. I'd echo those comments. Yeah, we're very proud of the development and operation of it. The bringing it into the world for people in Ireland. To engage in that program. Indeed, just we've time and conscious that there's a fair few comments coming in. Which is great, and it's great to see the interaction from the audience. And just we have time for one more point, I think, before we bring the webinar to a conclusion. And just to gauge your thoughts, Pat, on the idea of, I suppose just to the preamble around it, I suppose, is that ongoing conversations, and you've mentioned outpatient consultations, with one psychiatrist, and having a positive relationship and discussions with GPs, one's GP, but the link between the medication regime that a person may be on, depression and bipolar disorder, and also and the third factor in it, is around pregnancy, or the desire maybe to start a family or to have a child, and what important factors are in the mix there from your perspective.
Right. I presume you mean in the context of medication or pregnancy generally?
Yeah, in the context of medication. Yeah.
Okay. I think that for any woman who's keen to become pregnant and they're on medication, in most instances, you can find a way around the problem. The first thing to remember is that the hormones of pregnancy are often mood stabilizing. If a person is keen to proceed with pregnancy, one can address it in a variety of ways. So at the outset, if somebody is on medication, the medication needs to be very often tapered down gently over before conception and pregnancy. So it's often the time between stopping the medication and being able to become pregnant. The person might have a bumpy period in terms of mood, very often more on the depression side than on the high side.
Yes.
As the hormones of pregnancy kick in, the person's mood will stop. because the hormones are probably more on the antidepressant side and have a mood elevating effect. Sometimes a small amount of an anti-elatant is needed to help stabilize.
Yeah.
But you're talking about micro amounts generally.
Yeah, generally. And
secondly, you can indicate to the person how to use medication in very minute, literally half or quarter tablets, maybe every third day or something, enough to just quell the tendency for the mood to go on the high side.
Yeah.
Now, it's important then that once, well, I should just say, the other point is that certain treatments, such as lithium, you cannot really take in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Other mood stabilizers that don't have an effect on the fetus can be taken during that time. Now, once the baby is born, it's very important that the mother gets back on the medication given the diagnosis of bipolar as soon as the baby is born. Otherwise, they will run into a very significant depression and not be able to manage their baby, or still, they become quite elated.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to be afraid about. Talk to your psychiatrist, I would say, in this instance. And plan ahead. Don't rush into something like this. Because taking away the medication and so forth, it takes.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Pat. I suppose in an overall sense, and I'm conscious of time, and it is to my regret at some remove to say that we can't get to everyone's points in the audience. And thank you so much for offering your thoughts, comments, and questions to this webinar. And I hope, and I suppose I do know, from my own perspective, listening to you, Pat, that going back to the three pillars of aware, that people in this webinar will have found it supportive from a kindness and compassionate idea, around that it's treatable. Depression and bipolar disorder are treatable, informative in relation to the answers you gave, and educational too, and going back to those three pillars that we offer to people at Aware, through the support and educational programs that we have, that this conversation is enlightening and helpful for us all. So I just want to thank you for taking the time and giving your considered insight into the conditions of depression and bipolar disorder in managing as best we can. And that message of hope is alive and well and very important to promote to people in the community and people experiencing depression and bipolar disorder. So thank you. And just to say to people in the audience, that I encourage you, you'll receive a link to complete a survey about how you found the webinar. And also, if you haven't registered, you can register for our future webinars on the website, aware.ie, and you'll find a registration link there, aware.ie/webinars. And just to say as well to everyone from a safety perspective, but encourage you as well too, if you've been impacted by any of the discussion, or if you've been triggered or activated from the discussion that's been just held over the past hour, we would encourage you to reach out to your GP, and also to use the Aware services. Our support line is open 10 to 10, 365 days of the year, and you can reach that through 1800 80 48 48, and also to visit our website aware.ie. We have a number of support groups that a person can attend, via Zoom and in person. So for further information, to go to aware.ie. And thank you again for your contribution, and we look forward to seeing you again at our webinar in November, which is on all things mindfulness. So have a lovely afternoon, everyone who's taken part this afternoon, and thanks again to Karen for hosting it and setting it up, and to you, Pat, for your time and considered wisdom on the subject.
Thank you.